Lysara lay motionless, her body pressed against the cold, rocky ground. Her once formidable strength drained away with each shallow breath. The attack had come faster than she anticipated. The ambush had been merciless, her loyal fighters gunned down before her eyes. Now, abandoned on a desolate planet, she was a wounded, bleeding shadow of the warrior princess who had once led a defiant rebellion against her father's corrupt empire. The landscape around her mirrored her own despair. Harsh winds swept over the barren terrain, sending clouds of dust into the air. There was no vegetation, no life. The sky above was a sickly gray, as if the world itself was mourning her fall. Lysara could feel the darkness closing in, the inevitable end drawing nearer. But more painful than the wounds inflicted on her body was the deep sense of betrayal that clawed at her mind. Her people had left her for dead. The Imperial forces had hunted her down, their orders clear: eliminate the traitor, show no mercy. She gritted her teeth, pushing herself up against a jagged rock. Every movement sent waves of agony through her body, but she refused to give up. Her mind replayed the events of the assassination attempt, the way everything had spiraled out of control. She had been so sure, so confident, that this was the moment her father's reign would end. Her carefully laid plans had fallen apart in an instant. There had to be something more. A betrayal from within her inner circle? No, it was worse than that. Her family had sabotaged her. They had set her up to fail. The realization hit her like a second wound, deep and unforgiving. She had always known her family was ruthless, but to orchestrate her downfall in this way, to sacrifice her so easily, as if she were a pawn in their game? The rage burned in her chest, but it was accompanied by helplessness. What could she do now, stranded and broken, with no one left to trust? In the distance, the sound of footsteps echoed faintly across the rocks. Lysara stiffened, her hand instinctively reaching for her weapon, though it felt heavy in her grasp. Her vision blurred as she tried to focus on the approaching figure. A lone man, moving cautiously through the ravine. He wore battle-worn armor, and his face was set in a hard, unreadable expression. Captain Daniel had been wandering this forsaken planet for weeks, scavenging whatever he could to survive. He had been betrayed once too often, left behind by his employers after a mission gone wrong. They had written him off as collateral damage, expendable like so many others. He trusted no one, and he had no reason to. His life had become a series of lonely, brutal days, driven only by the instinct to keep going. As Daniel navigated the rocky landscape, his sharp eyes caught the faint glint of metal. A figure, half hidden in the shadows, slumped against the rocks. He moved closer cautiously, his hand hovering near his blaster. It wasn't often that he came across survivors out here. More often than not, the people left on this planet were already dead. When he reached her, Daniel could see she was gravely injured. Blood stained her armor, and her breathing was labored. He crouched down, his eyes narrowing as he assessed her condition. She was still conscious, but just barely. Her eyes flickered open, and she met his gaze, her expression a mixture of pain and defiance. "Who are you?" Daniel asked, his voice low and guarded. Her response was weak but steady. "A fighter, a resistance fighter." Daniel raised an eyebrow. Resistance? He'd heard rumors of a rebellion brewing against the Zyrian Empire, but he had stayed out of it. Politics and revolutions were for those with hope, and he had long since abandoned hope. Still, something about this woman struck him as different. There was a strength in her, even in her weakened state, that intrigued him. "You're not in a position to be fighting anyone right now," Daniel said, glancing at her injuries. "You're lucky you're not dead already." She didn't respond immediately, but he could see the tension in her jaw. She wasn't about to admit how close she was to giving up. Daniel debated with himself for a moment. He could leave her here, continue on his way, and not get involved. But something held him back. Maybe it was the look in her eyes, or maybe it was because he knew what it felt like to be left behind. Against his better judgment, he reached down, helping her to her feet. She winced in pain but didn't protest. As he supported her weight, guiding her toward the shelter of a nearby cave, He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this woman than she was letting on. "Why help me?" she asked quietly, her voice barely audible. Daniel glanced at her, his expression hard. "Because I've been where you are." They reached the cave, and Daniel gently lowered her to the ground, his mind already racing with thoughts of how to treat her wounds. He didn't know who this resistance fighter really was, but for now, that didn't matter. He'd made a choice, and there was no turning back. Lysara watched him move about the cave, gathering supplies. She was exhausted, every part of her body screaming in pain, but something about this human gave her a sense of cautious hope. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know the weight of her name or the target on her back. For now, that was her only advantage. As Daniel worked, Lysara closed her eyes, allowing herself a moment of respite. The danger wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time since the ambush, she wasn't alone. Daniel's hidden outpost was a place born out of necessity rather than comfort. The underground bunker, carved into the rock face, was stark and functional. Its walls were lined with scavenged technology, makeshift communication arrays, weapon caches, and survival tools, all of it pieced together from his years on the planet. Every item had a story of its own, and each was essential for his survival. There was no room for luxury here, just the essentials. The air inside was cold and metallic, filled with the hum of old machines and the faint crackle of a failing power generator. As Lysara lay on the cot in the corner, her body slowly healing, she observed the space around her. It was clear that Daniel had lived alone for a long time. There was a certain order to everything, a strictness that mirrored his own personality. It reminded her of her early days in the Resistance, before the rebellion grew, before her father's betrayal. She could tell that, like her, Daniel had learned to rely on himself and no one else. The loneliness in his eyes was familiar, a reflection of her own isolation. Days passed, and Lysara's body began to recover, though the process was slow and painful. She kept her true identity hidden, telling Daniel only fragments of her story. She spoke of the resistance, the fight against tyranny, but never mentioned her royal blood or her family. The truth was too dangerous, not just for her but for Daniel as well. The more she told him, the more she realized how much he had been burned by betrayal in the past. Revealing herself now would only complicate things further. Daniel wasn't one to ask too many questions. He accepted her vague answers without pressing, though it was clear he was curious. He had his own reasons for staying guarded. His past was just as murky, shaped by events he rarely spoke about. Over time, however, small bits of his history slipped through their conversations. He talked about the mission that had gone wrong, how his employers had left him behind to die. It was clear that betrayal had scarred him deeply, and it was this shared experience of being forsaken that brought them closer. Lysara found herself drawn to his quiet strength, his ability to carry on despite everything. She could tell he had been through hell, and yet here he was, helping a stranger without expecting anything in return. His sense of honor surprised her, especially in a world where trust was a luxury few could afford. There were moments when she wanted to tell him the truth, to let him know who she really was, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. Not yet. Daniel, for his part, had grown to respect Lysara. He saw her resilience, her determination to heal and fight again despite her injuries. He'd seen plenty of people break under far less, but not her. She wasn't like anyone he had met before, and though he didn't fully understand what drove her, he recognized the same fire that had once burned inside him. Over the course of her recovery, they shared more stories of their pasts, their betrayals, and their losses. It was a strange comfort to know they weren't alone in their pain. But despite the growing bond, there was an unspoken tension between them. Lysara's silence about certain parts of her life didn't go unnoticed. Daniel wasn't a fool. He knew there was more to her story than she let on. He didn't push her for answers, but the questions hung in the air between them, unanswered and growing heavier with each passing day. Lysara, too, felt the weight of what she wasn't saying. Her mind often drifted back to the moment of the assassination attempt, the chaos, the betrayal, and the lingering sense that something far larger was at play. Strange things had happened during the mission, details that didn't add up. At first, she had chalked it up to bad luck or miscommunication, but now, with time to think, the pieces were falling into place. It hadn't just been a failure of the resistance. Someone within her own family had sabotaged the mission, ensuring her downfall. The more she thought about it, the more it made sense. Her family, the imperial court, had always been ruthless, but this was a different level of treachery. She was meant to die that day, not just fail. They had wanted her gone, eliminated as a threat. The implications were terrifying, but she kept these realizations to herself. There were too many unknowns, too many dangers. If Daniel found out, it could change everything. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The Empire wouldn't leave things unfinished. Sooner or later they would come looking for her, and when they did, Daniel would be caught in the crossfire. Every day that passed, she became more certain of it. One night, as they sat in the dim light of the bunker, Daniel spoke quietly. "You're not just a resistance fighter, are you?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unavoidable. Lysara hesitated, her mind racing for the right response. She could lie again, but the bond they had formed made that harder with each passing day. Trust was fragile, and another lie could shatter what little they had built together. "I was," she finally said, her voice steady but cautious. "But it's complicated." Daniel studied her, his eyes narrowing slightly, but he didn't press further. Instead, he nodded, accepting her half-truth, at least for now. He wasn't the type to force answers, but it was clear he wasn't entirely convinced. Something about her didn't fit the typical mold of a resistance fighter. She was too composed, too strategic, and there was an air of command about her that felt out of place. As the days continued, that lingering doubt stayed with him. There were moments when he caught her looking at the horizon with a faraway gaze, as if she were waiting for something, or someone. He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever trouble had brought her to this planet wasn't over. If anything, it was only just beginning. Unbeknownst to Daniel, Lysara's suspicions were growing stronger. The strange events during the assassination attempt, the Imperial forces abandoning her so easily, the whispers she had overheard in the final moments before the attack, it was all starting to point to one horrifying conclusion. Her family was behind it. And if they were willing to betray her, they wouldn't stop at taking her down. The Empire had bigger plans that involved far more destruction than she had initially imagined. As Lysara pieced together the full picture in her mind, she knew that she couldn't keep the truth from Daniel for much longer. The storm was coming, and when it hit, they would both be caught in the middle. The Empire's reach was vast, and its agents relentless. Across the galaxy, word had spread about the princess who had betrayed her own blood. Bounty hunters and Imperial soldiers alike combed desolate worlds, desperate to find any trace of her. Lysara's enemies weren't looking to bring her back to face justice. They had one goal: eliminate her and bury the conspiracy for good. Far from Daniel's hidden outpost, the search parties intensified. The Empire was tightening its grip, sending squads to neighboring planets and outposts where they suspected resistance forces might be hiding. But this wasn't just about the rebellion anymore. Lysara had information, knowledge that could topple the royal family itself. If she lived long enough to tell her story, the very structure of the Empire could crumble. That made her more dangerous than any resistance fighter ever could be. Back in the bunker, Lysara had slowly regained her strength, though the wounds, both physical and emotional, still weighed heavily on her. The quiet moments alone gave her time to reflect, and with each day, the pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. She hadn't just failed the assassination, she had been set up from the start. Her family had orchestrated everything, planning not only for the mission to fail but for her to be left behind as a scapegoat. Her death was never a consequence of failure, it had always been part of the plan. The realization chilled her. She could see it now, the careful precision with which her own flesh and blood had plotted her demise. They had needed a distraction, a way to shift blame for the rebellion onto her while they consolidated power. And the most horrifying part was that she had never seen it coming. Lysara had always known her family was corrupt, but she had underestimated just how far they would go to secure their control. She glanced over at Daniel as he worked silently in the corner, tinkering with some damaged equipment. He had no idea who she really was. And for now, that was still her only advantage. The more Lasara thought about it, the more conflicted she became. Daniel had been nothing but honorable to her, helping her without knowing the truth. If she revealed her true identity, would he still see her as the woman he had come to trust, or would he turn on her like everyone else? There was no way to know. She felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her. Her enemies were closing in, and she couldn't afford to be reckless. But hiding the truth from Daniel wasn't without its own risks. The longer she stayed here, the more danger she put him in. Her family wouldn't stop until they were both dead. Days passed, and the tension inside the bunker grew. There was an unease that neither of them spoke of, but it hung in the air between them. Lasara could sense it too. Something was wrong. The Empire's reach extended far beyond what Daniel believed, and it was only a matter of time before they caught up with her. The attack came without warning. It started as a distant rumble, the sound of ships descending from the sky, followed by the unmistakable crack of blaster fire. The ground shook as the first shots hit the surface, sending debris and dust into the air. Daniel was on his feet in an instant, grabbing his weapon and moving toward the entrance. Lasara, still not fully recovered, forced herself up, ignoring the sharp pain in her side. The Imperial soldiers stormed the bunker, their armor gleaming under the dim light as they advanced. It didn't take long for Lasara to recognize them for what they were, rogue elements of her father's forces, sent not to capture her but to silence her forever. They had been tipped off by someone who knew Daniel's whereabouts, likely his former employers, eager to cash in on the bounty hanging over both of their heads. Daniel moved quickly, taking out the first few soldiers with precision. Lasara, despite her injuries, grabbed a weapon from the stash he had built over the years. Her body screamed in protest, but the adrenaline coursing through her veins dulled the pain. This was a fight for survival now, and she wasn't going to let these soldiers end her life so easily. The battle was brutal, chaotic, with flashes of light and the sound of weapons discharging filling the air. Lasara and Daniel moved in sync, their instincts aligning as they fought off wave after wave of attackers. Daniel, a seasoned mercenary, showed his skill with every shot, while Lasara, a warrior princess in her own right, matched him with her combat prowess. But it was more than just a fight. This was their first real test as allies, their lives intertwined by circumstance. They had only each other to rely on now, and despite the secrets between them, there was an unspoken trust growing with every enemy they felled. As the last of the soldiers fell to the ground, the bunker went quiet again, the smoke and dust settling around them. Lasara collapsed against the wall, her body trembling from the effort. Daniel knelt beside her, his face grim but calm. They had survived, for now. But the attack had been a clear message: the Empire wasn't giving up. They had found her, and they would keep coming until she was dead. Daniel understood this as well. The look in his eyes told her that he knew things were far from over. "Whoever sent them knows we're here," he said, his voice steady but tense. "They'll come back, and next time, they won't stop until we're both dead." Lasara nodded, her breathing still heavy from the fight. The realization hit her hard: this was no longer just her battle. Daniel was now involved, and whether she liked it or not, they were in this together. As the adrenaline began to fade, the weight of what had just happened settled in. Lasara knew she couldn't hide the truth much longer. The attack had changed everything. The Empire was closing in, and the only way to survive would be to face the truth head-on. She wasn't just a resistance fighter anymore, she was the key to unraveling the Empire's web of lies. And if she didn't act soon, they would both be crushed under its weight. After the attack, Lasara sat in silence, her mind racing. She knew the moment had come, the one she had been dreading since Daniel first found her. There was no more hiding. The Imperial soldiers weren't going to stop until they had her head, and Daniel was now caught in the crossfire. She owed him the truth, even if it shattered everything they had built together. Daniel, pacing the room, was tense. He wasn't the type to show fear, but the weight of the attack clearly weighed on him. He had seen the look in those soldiers' eyes. They hadn't come to capture, they had come to kill. "I need to tell you something," Lysara said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. Daniel stopped and turned to face her, sensing the gravity of her words. "I'm not just a resistance fighter," she began, her gaze meeting his, unwavering. "I'm Lysara, heir to the Zyrian Empire." The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Daniel's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, then to something darker, betrayal. He took a step back, as if the revelation itself had physically struck him. "You're what?" His voice was low, but the anger was building. "You're one of them? You're the Empire?" Lysara nodded, feeling the weight of his accusation, but she couldn't back down now. "Yes, I am, or I was. But my family betrayed me. They set me up, framed me for the assassination attempt. They wanted me out of the way, and now they want me dead." Daniel's jaw clenched, his fists tightening at his sides. "So this whole time, you've been lying. You let me believe you were one of the good guys, that you were just fighting against the Empire. I didn't have a choice." Lysara's voice rose, but it wasn't anger that fueled it. It was desperation. "If I told you the truth from the beginning, would you have helped me? Would you have trusted me?" Daniel's eyes flashed with anger. "I don't know. I don't even know who you are anymore. For all I know, you're just as bad as the rest of them." "I'm not," Lysara said, her voice softer now, pleading. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't want to be part of the Empire. That's why I joined the Resistance in the first place. But my family, my father, he saw me as a threat, so he used me. He set me up to die." Daniel turned away, his hands running through his hair, trying to process everything. The betrayal he felt mirrored the same sense of abandonment that had haunted Lysara for weeks. They were both victims, both pawns in a much larger game. But that didn't make it any easier for him to accept. "And what now?" he finally asked, his voice tight with frustration. "You expect me to just keep helping you? After all of this?" Lysara took a deep breath, knowing that the hardest part was still to come. "There's more. It's not just about me. My family isn't just after me to keep their hands clean. They're planning something bigger, something that could wipe out entire planets, rebel planets." She paused, watching Daniel's reaction. He was listening, though his face was still hard, his eyes cold. "They're going to frame me for a massacre. They'll wipe out the Resistance, destroy everything in their path, including Earth. And they'll blame it on me. It's how they'll consolidate their power. No one will question them after that." Daniel stared at her, his face a mix of shock and disgust. "Earth?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're going to hit Earth." Lysara nodded, feeling the weight of the revelation sink in. "Yes. And I had no idea until recently. They've been using me from the start, planning this all along." For a moment, Daniel said nothing. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in around them. His mind raced, putting together the pieces. His employers, the ones who had left him stranded on this planet, they had been part of this. They had sent him on missions without giving him the full story, using him just like they had used Lysara. "Your family," he said slowly, his voice trembling with rage. "They hired me. They hired me to kill you." Lysara's heart sank. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed still hit her like a punch to the gut. Daniel, the man who had saved her, had been sent to end her life. "I didn't know," he continued, his anger turning inward now. "I didn't know who you were. They didn't tell me. I thought I was just taking down another rebel leader, someone who was threatening their power. I didn't know it was you." Lysara could see the conflict in his eyes. He had been betrayed, just like her, used by the very people he despised. But now, they were both stuck in the same web of lies. "I understand if you hate me," she said quietly. "I understand if you want to walk away. But I need your help. We can stop them. We can stop the massacre, but I can't do it alone. Daniel didn't respond immediately. His eyes were locked on the floor, his thoughts churning. He had saved her life, but now he realized that by doing so, he might have put his own people at risk. Earth was in the crosshairs, and everything he had fought for, everything he believed in, was at stake. "How do I know you're telling the truth now?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Lysara's eyes met his, unwavering. "You don't. But I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to help me stop them. For Earth. For all the people who are going to die if we don't act." Daniel stood there for what felt like an eternity, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. His instincts told him to walk away, to leave her to face the consequences of her family's actions. But another part of him, the part that still believed in honor, in doing the right thing, knew he couldn't turn his back on her. Not now. Finally, he spoke, his voice firm. "I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it because I won't let Earth burn." Lysara nodded, her relief palpable. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was enough. For now, they had a common goal, and that would have to be enough to see them through what was coming next. With time running out, Lysara and Daniel knew there was only one way to stop the massacre. They had to intercept the Imperial transmission before it was sent. The transmission would signal the beginning of the end for Earth and several rebel planets, triggering a wave of destruction that would leave no survivors. Lysara's family had orchestrated everything meticulously, ensuring that the moment the signal was sent, the galaxy would believe she was responsible for the atrocities. They had one shot. The Imperial outpost on the planet was heavily guarded, but it housed the key communication systems. The plan was simple: infiltrate, reach the transmission center, and shut it down. But nothing about this mission would be easy. Every step would be met with resistance, and the Empire would stop at nothing to protect its plans. The air was thick with tension as they prepared for the final push. Both knew that failure wasn't an option. Lysara, once a hunted fugitive, now stood as the last line of defense against her family's genocidal plans. And Daniel, who had once been hired to kill her, was now fighting at her side. Their bond had been forged in fire, but this battle would test them both to their limits. The approach to the outpost was treacherous, the terrain rough and unforgiving. As they neared the perimeter, Daniel scouted ahead, finding the gaps in the patrols. They moved swiftly, silently, navigating the outpost's defenses with a precision born of experience. But once inside, the fight began. The first wave of Imperial soldiers hit them hard. Blaster fire echoed through the narrow corridors as Lysara and Daniel fought their way deeper into the complex. Every step forward was met with resistance, and the closer they got to the transmission center, the more intense the opposition became. Lysara moved with the skill of a warrior who had faced death before, her every strike a testament to her determination. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore, she was fighting for all the lives that hung in the balance. Daniel, too, was relentless. His calm, calculated approach to combat made him a force to be reckoned with. Together, they were unstoppable. But as the battle wore on, it became clear that the Empire had anticipated their move. Reinforcements poured in, and the corridors became a brutal battlefield. The stakes were higher than ever. If they failed, there would be no second chance. Finally, they reached the transmission center, but they weren't alone. Standing between them and the control room was an Imperial commander, one of Lysara's father's most loyal enforcers. He had been expecting them. "You're too late," the commander sneered, his weapon raised. "The transmission is ready to go." "It's over, Lysara." Lysara's eyes narrowed. "It's not over until I say it is." The fight that followed was brutal, each strike heavy with the weight of everything that was at stake. The commander was skilled, but Lysara had more to fight for. She had spent her life fighting against everything her family stood for, but now, she was fighting to prevent them from committing an atrocity that would destroy millions of lives. As the battle raged, Lysara realized that the only way to stop this madness for good was to embrace the role she had been running from. She couldn't just be the rebel princess anymore, she had to be the heir, the one who could challenge her family's authority. With one final, decisive blow, Lysara brought the commander to his knees. The victory felt hollow, but there was no time to dwell on it. The transmission center was just ahead. Together, Lysara and Daniel entered the control room. The console was active, the countdown already in progress. They had moments to stop the transmission from being sent. Lysara's hands moved quickly across the controls, overriding the system and shutting down the signal. The room fell silent, the threat of destruction gone. But the cost had been great. Lysara stood there, staring at the console, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on her. She had stopped the massacre, but she knew it wasn't enough. Her family was still out there, still in control. The Empire would continue to spread its lies unless someone stood up to them, and that someone had to be her. She turned to Daniel, her face set with determination. This isn't over. If I don't act now, they'll just find another way to consolidate their power. I have to make a stand, publicly denounce them. Take the throne. Daniel looked at her, his expression unreadable. He had seen the transformation in her, watched as she went from being a fugitive to someone who was ready to lead. But he also knew what this decision meant for both of them. You do what you have to do, he said quietly. But this isn't my fight anymore. Lysara nodded, understanding. Daniel had already sacrificed so much, and this wasn't his battle to finish. He had been pulled into something far larger than he had ever intended, and now, it was time for him to walk away. You've done more than enough, she said softly. I couldn't have stopped this without you. He gave her a small, almost sad smile. Just make sure it's worth it. Lysara watched as Daniel turned to leave, his silhouette fading into the distance. She knew they might never see each other again, but the bond they had forged would remain. He had saved her, and in doing so, had helped save millions of lives. As Lysara stood in the control room, the gravity of what lay ahead settled over her. She wasn't just fighting to stop a massacre anymore, she was fighting for the future of the galaxy. And now,